On July 2025, Sayfollah Musallet, a dual American-Palestinian citizen, was killed near Ramallah in the West Bank. His death sent shockwaves through both the local community and the international stage, drawing attention to the ongoing violence and instability in the region. Sayfollah, who had family ties in both the United States and Palestine, had traveled to the West Bank to visit relatives and to participate in what he believed would be a peaceful demonstration. He died during a protest against the expansion of Israeli settlements widely considered illegal under international law. The demonstration was organized by local activists and attended by people from various backgrounds, all united in their opposition to the ongoing encroachment on Palestinian land. The protest was meant to be a non-violent expression of resistance, a call for justice and respect for international agreements. Sayfollah was exercising his right to protest, a right he held as an American and as a Palestinian. He stood alongside others, holding signs and chanting for freedom, believing in the power of peaceful assembly to bring about change. His presence at the protest symbolized the connection between struggles for justice in different parts of the world. The demonstration was peaceful until armed Israeli settlers, some reportedly masked and carrying rifles, suddenly attacked the crowd. Chaos erupted as protesters scrambled for safety, and the atmosphere shifted from hopeful resistance to sheer terror in a matter of moments. Sayfollah and another protester, Mohammed Rizk Hussein al-Shalabi, were shot and killed in the violence that followed. Several others were wounded, some critically, as emergency responders rushed to the scene, trying to save lives amid the confusion and fear. The Palestinian Health Ministry confirmed both deaths and reported at least 10 others injured. Hospitals in the area were quickly overwhelmed, and families anxiously awaited news of their loved ones, hoping for miracles that would not come. What began as a protest quickly turned into a scene of bloodshed and mourning. The streets, once filled with chants and banners, were now marked by grief, shock, and the haunting silence that follows tragedy. Sayfollah's death highlights the dangers faced by those living under occupation and the risks for Americans in conflict zones. Even holding a U.S. passport could not shield him from the violence that has become all too common in the West Bank. He was entitled to the protection of his government, yet died while standing up for his beliefs. His story raises difficult questions about the responsibilities of nations to their citizens abroad, especially in areas of conflict. His story is a stark reminder of the human cost of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Each life lost is a family shattered, a community left to pick up the pieces, and a future forever changed. It raises urgent questions about justice, accountability, and the value placed on American lives abroad. The international response has been swift, but for many, it is not enough. For Sayfollah's family, the tragedy marked the beginning of a painful search for answers. They are left to mourn a son, a brother, and a friend, while demanding that his death not be forgotten or ignored. His loss became a rallying cry for justice and recognition, inspiring others to continue the struggle for dignity, safety, and peace in a land scarred by decades of conflict. In Florida, Sayfollah's family was devastated. The pain of losing a son, a brother, a loved one was overwhelming, an ache that filled every corner of their home. But what made their grief even harder to bear was the silence that followed, not just from neighbors or distant friends, but from their own government. The Musallets sat together, searching for comfort in each other's presence, but the absence of any meaningful response from officials left them feeling isolated and abandoned. The empty chair at the table was a constant reminder of what they had lost and of the indifference they now faced. Kamel Musallet, Sayfollah's father, refused to stay silent. He stood before cameras and reporters, his voice trembling with emotion as he publicly criticized President Trump and other officials for their lack of response. He demanded answers, not just for his family, but for all American families who had lost loved ones abroad. Days passed with no call from the White House or Congress. Only a generic condolence from the U.S. consulate arrived, a form letter that felt cold and impersonal. The phone rang, but it was never the call they hoped for. The halls of power remained silent. Kamel wondered if the response would have been different had his son been an Israeli-American. He looked at Sayfollah's passport, questioning whether his family's pain mattered less because of who they were or where their roots lay. "It's like living in two different worlds," he said, his voice heavy with pain and frustration. He felt like a second-class citizen in the country he called home, forced to watch as his son's life was treated as an afterthought. While the Musallets mourned, U.S. leaders carried on with business as usual. The machinery of government moved forward, seemingly untouched by the tragedy that had shattered one American family. Kamel noted that Sayfollah was the seventh American killed by Israeli forces or settlers in less than 2 years. Each name, each face, was a story cut short, a loss that barely registered in the halls of power. Each time, official silence followed. The doors of government offices stayed closed, and the press quickly moved on to other stories, leaving families like the Musallets to grieve alone. The family's grief was deepened by the fear that Sayfollah's death would be forgotten, lost in the noise of daily headlines and political debates. They clung to each other, determined to keep his memory alive. Their fight for answers had only just begun. For the Musallets, seeking justice was not just about their son, it was about demanding dignity, recognition, and change for all families who had been met with silence. The July 11th protest aimed to peacefully oppose a new Israeli settler outpost. For Palestinians, these outposts represent the ongoing loss of land and hope. Sayfollah joined others to make their voices heard. Eyewitnesses described how armed settlers arrived, turning the protest into chaos. The settlers attacked with guns, clubs, and even ran over a protester with a car. An ambulance arriving to help the wounded was also attacked. The violence was relentless, leaving 2 dead and many injured. What began as a stand for rights ended in bloodshed. The incident exposed the unchecked power of settlers in the West Bank. Palestinians who protest face grave risks, and often no protection. After the attack, Israeli forces arrived at the scene, their presence unmistakable. Yet despite the gravity of the violence that had just occurred, they made no arrests. The flashing lights and military vehicles offered an illusion of order, but for those watching, it quickly became clear that justice would not be served that day. The armed settlers who killed and injured protesters were allowed to simply walk away, their weapons still in hand. No questions were asked, and no attempts were made to detain or even identify them. The sense of impunity was palpable, as if the rules did not apply to them. This lack of action sent a chilling message to everyone in the area. Violence by settlers is met with impunity, and the authorities are unwilling or unable to intervene. The empty handcuffs and protest signs became symbols of a justice system that looks the other way. In stark contrast, Palestinians are often arrested for far less, sometimes for simply protesting or being present at the scene. While settlers walk freely past police, Palestinians face immediate and harsh consequences, highlighting a deep and troubling double standard. The attack on the ambulance was especially egregious, a blatant violation of international law and basic human decency. Ambulances are meant to save lives, not become targets in a conflict. Medical personnel, who are supposed to be protected under international conventions, found themselves under threat. Even as they tried to help the wounded, they became targets, forced to work in fear for their own safety. The absence of accountability only deepened the community's sense of injustice and despair. People gathered in mourning, their faces marked by grief and frustration, knowing that their suffering was unlikely to be acknowledged by those in power. Families mourned their loved ones, haunted by the knowledge that the perpetrators might never face justice. The pain of loss was compounded by the reality that the system meant to protect them had failed once again. This ongoing cycle of violence and impunity erodes any hope for peace or reconciliation. Barriers grow higher, both physical and emotional, as trust in the possibility of justice fades away. The events of that day revealed a broken system of justice in the occupied territories, a system where laws are selectively enforced and accountability is rare. For many, it was a tragic confirmation of their worst fears, that justice is not blind and that their lives and losses may never truly matter in the eyes of those who hold power. In the U.S., the government's response to Sayfollah's killing was silence. President Trump, who championed America First, made no statement. Florida's senators said nothing. Only one local representative offered a brief, cautious condolence. No one named Israel or the settlers as responsible. This muted reaction contrasted sharply with how the U.S. usually responds when Americans are harmed abroad. The lack of outrage suggested that some American lives are valued differently. For the Musallet family, the silence was a second wound. It sent a message that their son's life mattered less. The government's inaction left them, and many others, questioning the meaning of citizenship. Just before Sayfollah's death, a journalist asked the State Department how it protects Palestinian-Americans from settler violence. The response was vague. Citizens should contact Israeli authorities for help. This effectively outsourced American safety to those accused of enabling the violence. When pressed to condemn settler attacks, the spokesperson offered only generic concern about violence on all sides. This both sides rhetoric ignored the specific threat facing Palestinian Americans. The government's ambiguity avoided confronting its ally Israel, but it left Palestinian Americans feeling exposed and unprotected. The lack of clear policy or condemnation set the stage for the silence after Sayfollah's death. For many, it was a sign that their government would not stand up for them. The cost of diplomatic caution was paid by families like the Musallets. The silence over Sayfollah's death reflected broader Trump administration policies. The administration cracked down on pro-Palestinian speech, especially on campuses. In early 2025, Trump signed executive orders targeting students who criticized Israel, equating such criticism with anti-Semitism. New travel bans required ideological vetting of students supporting Palestinian rights. These moves signaled hostility toward pro-Palestinian advocacy and closer alignment with Israel's right wing. The administration's stance made it risky to speak out for Palestinian rights, even in America. The lack of response to Sayfollah's killing was an extension of this policy. For Palestinian Americans, it meant their rights and safety were a lower priority. While the U.S. stood by Israel, other Western nations began to push back. In May 2025, Britain, France, and Canada condemned Israel's actions in Gaza and warned of possible sanctions. The UK suspended trade talks and sanctioned violent Israeli settlers. The European Union considered reviewing its agreements with Israel. International patience was wearing thin, and pressure for accountability was growing. Meanwhile, the Trump administration focused on business deals with Gulf states and nuclear talks with Iran. The U.S.-Israel alliance remained strong, but America's priorities were shifting. The killing of a Palestinian-American did not fit the administration's agenda. Silence was the path of least resistance, avoiding conflict with Israel and ignoring calls for justice. The Musallet family's tragedy was lost in the shuffle of global politics. Sayfollah Musallet's story exposes a painful double standard. He was killed while protesting peacefully, yet his government offered no outrage or demand for justice. The silence from U.S. leaders stood in stark contrast to their usual response when Americans are harmed abroad. For the Musallet family, it was a bitter lesson about whose lives are valued. The case highlights the cost of unchecked settler violence and a U.S. policy that shields Israel from criticism. Justice for Palestinian Americans remains elusive. Sayfollah's death forces us to ask, does American citizenship guarantee equal protection? When the government chooses silence, what does that say about our values? For families like the Musallets, the search for justice continues, against the odds.